Right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Standards Committee. Before we start the meeting, may I remind all of you that your phone should be switched to silent or turned off for the duration of the meeting, and your microphones should also be switched off unless you intend to speak. And if you do wish to speak or ask a question or make a comment, can you please indicate by raising your electronic hand? Or if you're here in the council chamber, obviously we can indicate in person. And finally, I will assume that you have all read the papers for the meeting. Thank you very much. First of all, are there any apologies for absence?
No, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And any declarations of interest from anybody, please? Sarah.
So I'm not actually sure there is a declaration of interest, but the person mentioned in item 9 is a colleague of mine on Gwaith Community Council.
No, Councillor Thomas. I think a personal interest, obviously, because of your connection, is fine, but there's no need to declare it as prejudicial in this sense, so you can carry on and remain part of the process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Our next item is the Forward Work Programme.
If I could just come in then, Chair. So the Forward Work Programme is just before members at the moment, and what I've actually undertaken at this stage is just plot a sort of provisional Forward Work Programme for our next set of meetings based on some of the items that we talked about in our annual report as our priorities for the forthcoming year. And I've also added a couple of the other individual matters which I need to bring to members throughout the course of the year. Following the conclusion of this meeting, we do have a Forward Work Programme session, which will give members an opportunity then to talk about other matters which they'd wish to consider, which I can then plot into that timetable then as well, but just before members ultimately for noting today, Chair.
Thank you very much. So we note the Forward Work Programme and look forward to our workshop at the end of the meeting. Item 4 is the minutes of the last meeting, which was held on the 11th of April 2023. May I have your approval that they are a correct record of the meeting? Yes. Thank you very much. Those minutes are approved. Item 5 is the South West Wales Corporate Joint Committee. Craig.
Thank you very much, Chair. So this is something novel, obviously, that not all standards committees within Wales will be dealing with at the moment, but we are the lucky ones who have one of these new functions, obviously, that sit with us. So back in 2021, new legislation was created by Welsh Government that tried to encourage local authorities in different regions to collaborate in respect of certain service areas, and the main areas in this case being the development of what's called a strategic development plan, which are the planning obligations which the localities need to consider as part of their overarching planning authority functions. The development of a regional transport strategy, which is work obviously to develop transport strategies, as it says, for the South West Wales region, and then ways to come together to promote the economic regeneration of the area. So what Welsh Government did was create what they call 4 corporate joint committees within Wales, and Neath Talbot forms part of the South West Wales Corporate Joint Committee, which comprises representatives from Neath Talbot, Swansea, Carmarthenshire and Pembrokeshire. So CJCs are still very much in their infancy at the moment, and we are still working through all of those processes, obviously, to enable them to be established. They are seen as being part of the local government family. So a lot of the obligations which fall on county borough councils will also be applicable to corporate joint committees as well. So the requirements that we place on our elected members and officers in respect of standards, ethics and ethical governance are all equally applicable to the work programme that the corporate joint committee undertake at the same time. So even though local authorities obviously still have responsibility for certain functions in respect of planning and transport, the applications and the usual aspects associated with that, when it comes now to developing the strategies and the policies in which we operate under, we now have to collaborate with our neighbouring authorities to bring these in place. So what has happened with that is we've split various work functions between the respective authorities, and the monitoring officer for the Corporate Joint Committee is actually myself. So the same responsibilities that I have for Neath Talbot Council, I also apply then to the Corporate Joint Committee at the same time. And what because there is that obligation as well to have an appropriate standards regime ultimately in place, it was felt that rather than actually create a separate standards committee to focus on the work of the Corporate Joint Committee, which given its current work programme and the remit in which it's operating on would be a sort of potential waste of resources, and it wouldn't have that day-to-day operational work programme to keep it sort of sustaining, we decided to declare one of the standards committees for the region as the standards committee for the Corporate Joint Committee. And so given that the monitoring officer function vested in myself, it made logical sense for Neath Talbot Standards Committee then to take that process forward. So the entirety of the ethical governance regime in which we operate, as I mentioned, is going to be equally applicable ultimately to the work programme of the Corporate Joint Committee. So all of the various documentation that we put in place for the elected members in Neath Talbot, like the Code of Conduct, Gifts and Hospitality, member officer protocols, and all of those various arrangements, we also need to have ultimately for the Corporate Joint Committee as well. And rather than rewriting the rule book, what we've effectively done is taken the fundamental versions that Neath Talbot operate under, and then the Corporate Joint Committee have ultimately adopted them as we move forward. So the purpose of the report today is just to give you that overview that as well as the work we do in respect of Neath Talbot Council, we do have a slightly different role in that we monitor the Corporate Joint Committee work programme as well. Now, the level of involvement I expect that we have is going to be a little bit more limited because we are only responsible for the standards function of the elected members who work in the Corporate Joint Committee for the Corporate Joint Committee work itself. So when they are doing the rest of their work, their constituency work, their local council work, it would be their authority standards committees that would take primacy in respect of those matters. But one of the things we have been looking to do with this Corporate Joint Committee is expand the pool of knowledge that people can bring ultimately to this organisation. So as well as having elected members ultimately on board and being able to vote on various matters, we've built in the ability for advisors to be appointed or co-opted members in some cases. So they will be professional organisations from regional bodies such as health boards, universities, who can all bring a very sort of interesting knowledge base ultimately to the work programme that the CJC is going to be undertaking. And we also as well have what we call a private sector group. So that's local businesses, local regeneration experts in that sense who can help bring their expertise then to the work of the CJC and subsequently on then to the local authorities. But we've recognised it's vitally important that because they are then becoming involved in what is public sector work effectively, those private sector individuals, the co-opted members, have an ethical governance framework in which they operate to. So we make sure that there is a code of conduct for them, an advisor agreement that they sign up to say that they are actually complying with all of the various code of conduct obligations, the obligations in respect of interest, which we know members are very accustomed to dealing with. Similar obligations will ultimately vest in them. So to make sure that there is transparency in that process, and when the advisors are coming into the work programme of the CJC, they do so for the benefit of the CJC as opposed to any of their own personal interests ultimately, which they have, given that they come mostly from a private sector business background. So there has been some work programs, as I mentioned in the report at paragraph 16 to date, where we've been putting all of the policies and all of the procedures ultimately in place. But as I mentioned, it's still very much in its infancy at this stage. But I wanted this report to come here today just to give you a flavour, obviously, of the type of work that's going on in respect of the CJC and what its remit ultimately will be. There may be some opportunities, of course, as well for you to observe a meeting of the Corporate Joint Committee as you would be observing other meetings, which we'll be talking about in future reports on the agenda today. So I'd be happy to take any questions, Chair, to answer any queries that members ultimately may have. Before you predominantly today, as I mentioned, just for noting so you could see what work is undertaken, but it's something we can develop over the course probably of the next couple of years as the CJC progresses and becomes more active in the work programme it undertakes.
Thank you, Craig. That's a very helpful summary of the CJC. Any questions or observations? I see, Sarah, you've got your hand up. Is that a legacy hand or is that a new hand?
It's a new hand, Chair.
New hand, yes.
So I enjoyed reading this. I was wondering, given the prominent role of yourself as monitoring officer and the standards committee here, would it be good to extend, the group leader sessions to members of this group, where they come to standards committee meetings and stuff?
It's a slightly different arrangement ultimately with the Corporate Joint Committee, Councillor Thomas, because there are no sort of group leaders ultimately as part of that particular process, because the way the representation ultimately works for the Corporate Joint Committee is that it's the leaders of the respective councils who are nominated as the voting members of that CJC. So the only 4 individuals ultimately who have a vote in respect of any decision-making processes are the 4 leaders from the respective authorities. Now, we've established other subcommittees, shall we say, of the CJC. So they have a responsibility to have a scrutiny committee, a governance and audit committee. And so we've put members on the respective authorities on those committees to be able to hold the CJC ultimately to account. But the group leader duties themselves are not really applicable in the CJC format. But of course, if you want to have an opportunity to speak to the leader or the chair of the Corporate Joint Committee as part of this work programme, that's Councillor Rob Stewart of Swansea Council, we can always look to invite him to a future meeting to see what approaches we can do and have some discussions on that.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that. I did have more, though.
Okay. You carry on, Sarah.
Okay, so on page 20, under the local resolution procedure, I noticed that like entries 2.1, 2.3, they seem almost like an addition to me. I'm more used to it starting around 2.4, but I was wondering who the moderators are, and if they're receiving mediation and conflict resolution training.
The moderators that we would tend to use in this scenario have been corporate directors within the council. So when you've had the local resolution process initiated within Neath Talbot Council, we try to find an individual who would have had that appropriate training. So that would be the corporate directors or one of the heads of service associated with this particular area. We've only ever had to use it once over the last few years, and we used a corporate director ultimately for that. So they are the individuals we tend to go for. We do look for somebody with seniority within the organisation, but again, as corporate directors and heads of service, we would have had various aspects of training, so we can bring that skill set hopefully to help in to try and resolve the issue.
Thank you. And then on pages 36 and 37, 4.2 and 4.3. So what are the consequences of failing? This is why you have to notify of changes to interest. What are the consequences of failing to do that, out of curiosity? And I wonder that not just in respect to the CJC, but generally as well.
It's actually probably a breach of the code of conduct at that point. So there's an obligation in the code of conduct for members to keep their interests up to date. So if it was the case that maybe interest hadn't actually been logged with myself as the monitoring officer, we could allege ultimately it was a code of conduct breach. It's not something I would imagine that would attract a great deal of sanction in the sense dependent on what the severity of the breach ultimately will be and what the motive was maybe for not ultimately disclosing it. But for the most part, it would probably be regarded as a minor breach of the code of conduct.
Okay, and then finally, sorry, pages 40 and 41. So 4.1 and 6.1 seem a little contradictory to me. This is under the declaration of interest. So 4.1 says there is absolutely no threshold, and then 6.1 lists a load of things that are acceptable. And it used to be, obviously this comes up later, it used to be that there was a £50 threshold. Later we talk about reducing it, but even in the bit later, again, it says there is no threshold and you have to report absolutely everything, and then 6.1 lists things, and I think that sort of almost contradicts itself.
I see exactly where you're coming from, Councillor Thomas, in that sense. I think what we're just trying to get at with the inclusion of 6.1 is that promotional gifts, pens, etc., we don't really regard them as gifts on hospitality for the purposes of what the declaration would ultimately be. So what the main obligation is that you would get something irrespective of value. So, for example, something that you've received, a bunch of flowers, bottle of wine, box of chocolates, that sort of element. But if you go on a course, for example, and you get a free pen or a free calendar, mouse mat, etc., we wouldn't really need to regard that as a gift for the purposes of a declaration under this particular policy.
Okay, thank you.
But I
That was
very
all
much
of my
see the point
questions.
what you're saying about irrespective of value. So I can certainly look at some words, and if we think we just need to tighten that up and clarify it a little bit better for members to be aware.
That was all my points. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. And I think that last point is a good point, because I think we've had conversations within the committee about newly elected members and about how they read this and interpret and whatever. So perhaps that clarification would be helpful. You know, even if it's something, for example, pens you might receive at a conference or something like that. So thank you, Sarah, for those points. Any other comments or observations? Wayne?
Yeah, just a simple question, Craig, really. You mentioned ourselves, Swansea City. Who are the other two authorities that are covered by the umbrella of the Joint Committee?
Pembrokeshire Council and Carmarthenshire Council. In respect, though, of the strategic planning function that the Corporate Joint Committee actually has, it also brings in our two National Park colleagues as well. So they have a vote in respect of anything on the strategic planning side of things. So for that particular area, conduct-wise, obviously, that they would be caught into that as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. The question really is about our commitment as a committee to deal with CJC things. I appreciate it's in its infancy. Do we have any sense of whether we need to have separate meetings, or would they be elements that are tagged onto this? Would they be discrete and standalone, for example?
That is what I'm aiming for, to try and make sure that obviously it's not creating an additional workload pressure, obviously, on the Standards Committee to be able to consider matters for the CJC. So there will be ad hoc reports ultimately, which will be brought to future meetings, which would cover some of the CJC aspects that we need to. If we are ever in a position, obviously, where we need to look at specific responses dealing with CJC related work, so whether there was an investigation which required a determination by members, we'd probably have to hold separate meetings perhaps to deal with that. Or if there was something maybe which came out of the woodwork that had a very specific CJC focus, which would require a lot of debate and a lot of time to discuss, we may need to convene a separate meeting to be able to do that. But the intention at the moment is that we'll try and bring it all under the umbrella of the current work programme and the current meeting setup.
Yeah, thank you. And just one other thing, is there a time-bound period in which Neath, Talbot and yourself are holding office for the Standards Committee for this CJC, or is it time unlimited?
It is time unlimited. I think it's going to be with me for a very long time in that sense. So the way in which it's operated from an officer perspective at the moment is that the chief executive role of the Corporate Joint Committee is rotating between the chief executives, between the respective authorities. But the monitoring officer function is predominantly going to be vested in myself. We're not seeing any change in that regard. Purely from a consistency perspective, it's probably better to sit with one person to make sure that all of these elements are continuing, and to make sure then that we're capturing what we need to do. But it's something that is going to increase as time goes on. I've got no sort of aspect for that to suggest otherwise. But at the moment, we're still in the process of constituting, getting everything established, which we've now done. We're quite ahead of the game compared to some other authorities as well. So we are just working our way through the system and getting everything operational. And as services progress and as the work programme progresses, they'll be starting to develop some of these new strategies and policies, and we'll be making sure that the standards regime is underpinning all of that work programme which they then undertake.
Lovely, thank you.
Any other questions or observations? Alison.
Purely an observation, Chair, in relation to the date on the report. Is that a typo? We've got 2022.
I've gone back in time. Absolutely. Yes, it is 13th of June 2023. It should be in that sense. Thank you for pointing that out.
One as well. Well spotted, and for accuracy in the archives, an essential point. Any other comments or observations? I've got a question, Craig. You mentioned about the subcommittees and, for example, Scrutiny Committee and the Governance and Audit. Will that comprise different members? I'm assuming it will, because the leaders wouldn't be sitting on the Scrutiny Committee. So in that regard, but will they be drawn from across the different councils?
Absolutely, yes. So the way in which we've structured it is that each authority has nominated 3 members from their respective authorities to sit on the Overview and Scrutiny Committee that's ultimately taken place. And similarly then, from the Governance and Audit perspective, there are 3 representatives from each authority, 2 elected members and 1 lay member. So our chair of the Governance and Audit Committee is Joanna Jenkins. Joanna also sits then as the Neath Talbot representative lay member to the Governance and Audit Committee of the CJC at the same time. So we've made sure that there are elected and representatives from each of the constituent authorities on that CJC Scrutiny Governance and Audit Committee to make sure then as well that the views of their respective authorities are being funneled through to that work programme as well.
Thanks, Craig. But it is early days, as you say, but quite clearly this is going to develop even further in terms of the work and also the demands on members as well. So it can be, I'm sure, quite an interesting addition to members' responsibilities. So I'm not sure if I should say congratulations for becoming the monitoring officer, but I think it is a very important position. So very proud that you've been selected, and we look forward to receiving more information about the CJC in due course. So the recommendation is that we note the delegation of the Standards Committee function to ourselves. And we note that for the records. Thank you very much. On to item 6, which is the attendance at council and town and community council meetings by the Standards Committee.
Thank you, Chair. So members will recall in the last meeting when we approved our annual report, we said one of the obligations we would look at throughout the course of the forthcoming year is ways in which we could have continued to observe council proceedings and committee proceedings within Neath Talbot Council itself, but also some of our town and community councils at the same time, so we could see how the standards regime has been impacted and developed within those particular meetings. I'm in the process now of just finalising a timetable of the various meetings which will be taking place from Neath Talbot's perspective and in some of our town and community councils, and I'll get that out to members in due course. And one of the suggestions that we had within the committee is that maybe 1 or 2 of these meetings be selected for members to drop into and observe and to see how they feel whether the ethical governance regime, the standards regime, is being impacted appropriately within those particular settings. The majority of these meetings are taking place in a virtual world still at the moment, so hopefully it will just be an opportunity for you to dial in remotely and see then ultimately what's happening. So I'll make sure that you obviously get a copy of that timetable, and you can pick and choose if there are any particular meetings that you would like to go to or you'd have the opportunity to attend. What I also thought might be appropriate is if we agreed a sort of collective feedback form, which would be something for you to just document some thoughts on, particularly at the meetings that you do attend. You could submit them back to myself, and we could use then this particular meeting as one of our forums for discussing what you saw within those meetings and any suggestions then we can build in for improvement. But what we would also look to do is share that feedback ultimately with the town and community councils themselves, so hopefully they can reflect and see if there are any aspects that they wish to improve on. So what I've done within your papers is include a very template report capturing the types of issues which I thought might be wise for us ultimately to consider. But obviously we can amend that if there are specific aspects you would like to include as a committee within that particular document, and we can have a master template then ultimately agreed. So happy to answer any questions, but Chair, we can take it from there.
Thank you, Craig. I have to say, I did like the feedback form. I think that's will be very useful for you to collect the comments, and it will add some sort of discipline, I think, to our visits in terms of, recording what we observe. So it could be very useful, that feedback, to input into our work programme. And I guess because it is, this will be the first time that we've used it, we may well amend it as time goes by, depending on how we see its use when we're attending the meetings. So there'll be plenty of meetings for us to go to. So it'd be good to have them all covered, I think, all the community councils, which should be relatively straightforward for us as they are being held virtually. So that'd be very helpful. I've attended a couple of myself. I'm sure others have here as well, but they are worthwhile doing, and it gives you an insight into the community councils. But also, I think, for our own knowledge and our own education about what's going on, particularly new members as well. It'll be good to attend both the community councils and, of course, the council meetings as well. So any questions or observations, Duncan?
On the feedback form, I'm just wondering, the questions I'm happy with, whether or not it might be useful to have a scale of response, for example, strongly agree to strongly disagree, a 5-point scale, or it could be a 10-point scale, which is numbered, 10 strongly agree down to 1, and then let people fill in. That way we'd be able then to capture all that data and to see what the average scores are. If you're trying to navigate through a bunch of narrative, it's a bit more difficult to interpret the collective of the data. So a scale might be useful, and still then leave space for a comment box if people wish to write something by way of observation. Just a thought.
Very good suggestion. Yes, because sometimes you can't think of the words, but you get a feeling of how it's working, don't you? But to put it actually into words is not always can't always quite find the right word. So that's a very helpful suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, and just wear my academic hat, try and avoid a midpoint on a scale. So don't have a 5-point scale, because quite often people will sit on the fence and just plump for the middle one. So have a 4-point scale, or something which forces a decision left or right of a midpoint. And equally, a very valid scale is the smiley face one. So you've got a very smiley face, a slightly smiley face, so a non-committed face through to an unhappy face, and that's a legitimate scale that's been used academically. So you can do it a number of ways, but I'm happy to talk with you, Craig, about that if you've got some thoughts.
Great, thank you very much. Wayne.
Thank you, Chair. I don't quite know how we word this, Craig, but I'm just wondering whether or not political fairness should come into that feedback report. How much political manipulation undergoes in these meetings over and above the decision that should be taken.
It would be feasible. I think we could include a question along the lines of, did you have concerns over the political impartiality of the way in which the meeting was constructed, and were all members given an opportunity to comment? And one, so I can come up with a question that will certainly cover off that. Absolutely, Councillor Carpenter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Any other comments, questions? Oh, Karen.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm just I say a little bit confused. We're going to have the schedule of these meetings. Are we going to have a rota to attend these meetings? I ask this because I wouldn't want, say, all of the committee to be attending one meeting. I think there was some trepidation in the One Voice Wales meeting regarding attendance. Some councillors there thought it was perhaps a bit of an intrusion, because, as we've already said, we don't want to be seen as the bad guys. We want to be seen as the good guy. So we've got to get that message across. But I'm just wondering if you were going to tell us who and when to go, or do we just decide that we want to go to a meeting and just turn up to it? Thank you.
What I was going to suggest, Councillor Edwards, is that obviously I'll issue the timetable out to members. If members can come back and highlight to me in advance which ultimate ones they're going to be in attendance of, or they would like ultimately to attend. If another member then contacts me, I can double check the list to see whether anyone else is ultimately going to be there. So I'll act as a funnel to be able to accommodate all of these ultimately for members. So what I thought I'd do is I'll get the list out there for you to see the times and dates. You might be able to give me some suggestions ultimately what works for you, dependent on any of all your sort of resources and abilities to attend different matters. But if I think we perhaps a little bit too heavy-handed, I'll come back and explain to you that maybe we've got 2 people who are going to be attending that meeting. We don't need any more. Could you potentially think about having another meeting instead? And I'll try and find a schedule then that accommodates everyone, because I very much don't want to create additional demands ultimately for yourself. You are very busy people, so we'll just try and find the odd slot here and there, which could then hopefully work for you.
And it's a very well made point, Karen. And I think perhaps if people indicate their availability, which gives then Craig flexibility to map out the visits. So if somebody say available for half a dozen of the meetings, they don't necessarily want to go to half a dozen, but it's about saying I am available on these slots. And then if somebody's only available for one, you can then factor in people's availability into that rota. So yes. Good. And I think, Karen, it's about us also learning from community councils. So, if you can convey that to your colleagues at the Wales Voice meeting, if those kind of comments are made, again, I think it comes back to the point that members here have made, that when you appear before the Standards Committee, people think they've done something wrong. But again, it's about us trying to convey, well, actually, the Standards Committee is here to help you, but also to learn from members as well, because that will help us to do a better job. And without these observations, we won't be able to do that, and we won't be able to help community councils and other councillors, both individually and as a whole council, as well as we could without these observations. So there is a positive side to it. We're not there just to police things.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the recommendation is that we agree the protocol. Oh, sorry, Wayne. Yeah.
Sorry, Chair. Craig, I think that's a very good point about having an agenda and reports, because I sat in one meeting that you advised me to go to, and that's all I had was an agenda. And without the backing papers, I was sitting there totally uninformed, both during the meeting and before the meeting. So I think that point is an important one. I just wonder whether we need to stress to the town councils, community councils, that there will be an observer, but could they have these papers beforehand? Thank you.
That would certainly be the plan. Obviously, once we can identify who the members will be attending various meetings, I'll be linking in with those particular clerks to make sure you get the necessary invites associated with that. And I'll be emphasising that you need to have all the requisite papers before ultimately that you attend that meeting as well. So I'll be taking care of all of that for you.
Thank you very much, Wayne. Any other comments? Thank you very much. Well, the recommendations is that we agree the protocol of our visits and observations for both the Neath Talbot Council meetings and the Town and Community Council meetings. So do we have approval for the protocol, please? Thank you very much. Next item, item 7, is social media training for elected members. Craig.
Thank you very much, Chair. So again, this ties into something that we were talking about in our previous annual report, that we thought the one area of work we could specifically look at a committee and come up with some recommendations and some matters for considerations would be in respect of social media and the way in which ultimately that our members choose to use it. We've all recognised the positives ultimately of social media and the way in which it can make our elected members more accessible to their constituents. But in recent years, we have seen some small increases in the number of complaints that have been made to the Ombudsman or members of the public contacting myself regarding comments that have been placed on social media. Now, in all of these cases, in the Neath Talbot element, there hasn't been any breach of the code of conduct which has been pursued ultimately by the Public Service Ombudsman, but it is recognised that the volume of these types of complaints now do ultimately increase. And ironically, I gave some training to members last week on the code of conduct, and we spoke a lot within that about social media and obviously some of the do's and don'ts and the various different principles that you have to follow. And I think the recognition that members are equally caught by their code of conduct principles when they're posting on social media is one of the interesting elements we've got to try and keep pursuing and make members ultimately understand. There's been a few sort of high-profile cases now in respect of social media that the Ombudsman Office has ultimately been included, and I mentioned one of those in the papers, the Surrey and Lavernock Community Council. Now that is where ultimately I think it went to a very much extreme with the types of postings that member was ultimately making on social media. But obviously it illustrates the types of matters that do need to be considered and how members do need to have that awareness of code of conduct obligations in respect of those matters, irrespective of whether they're posting as a county borough councillor, town and community councillor, or indeed as a private citizen. They are still going to be caught by some basic principles. So there's been various forms of guidance ultimately that have been released, some from the Public Service Ombudsman, some from organisations like the Welsh Local Government Association, which have tried to highlight ultimately some of these issues. And we always try to embed those principles then in the training that elected members have. And I've tried to give a general overview in your papers as to, well, what sort of training that members do have as part of this process. But as we identified, it's something I think we could always build on, and it could be quite a unique project ultimately for the committee ultimately to look into. So what we thought we would do over the course of the next year and going forward is have what would in effect be a sort of task and finish group. So it would be a discussion that takes place outside of the formal setting of the actual standards committee, where we can just have an opportunity to discuss it in more detail. I can give you some examples of the training that takes place. You'll be able to see all the different items that we then develop with members to give them that awareness. We would then look to have a session where we talk about, well, what can we do as a committee to try and address that? What different powers could be open to us? What different avenues for consideration could we look at trying to highlight to members, which I will go away then and write up, and then I'll bring it back ultimately to members for some consideration. So I've tried to set out a sort of 3-meeting cycle in the way in which we would look to do this, to make it more relevant, and obviously then to hopefully make it a manageable task ultimately for you on top of everything else and the details of those then that I'd set out in the report. The intention would be that we'll try and find a convenient date for these sessions to be held, but what we could potentially look at is having that session after our meeting of the standards committee, maybe an extra half hour, 45 minutes. So again, hopefully not make it too burdensome to any time commitment associated with it. I think there is a lot of benefit we could probably bring to this particular area, and I think it's something that members would welcome some increased guidance or a different support ultimately with, whether we create some briefing notes, fact sheets, examples, that sort of scenario I'm potentially having in mind, because I can see it is something that does cause members a lot of concern, and as they are encouraged ultimately for social media to have a greater presence and to do more in respect of that setting, the more work we can do to make sure that they are comforted and supported in the sort of standards regime in respect of those areas, I think could be quite beneficial. So with the appropriate chair, the outline of what I'm suggesting is included in the report. If members are happy, then we can adopt that and we can look to take it forward. But similarly, if there are different aspects of social media or other elements you wish to see, of course, we can factor those in as part of the discussions as well. I very much would welcome this being a sort of collaborative effort to see what more we can do to try and support our members in that regard.
Thank you, Craig. Comment? Oh, Sarah, got you. Hand up.
Thank you, Chair. So really, this might be more appropriate to talk about at the task and finish group, but obviously I don't know who's going to be on there. But I just thought it was worth noting that Mappolitic is a very nice platform for councillors in particular. I mean, it's for all levels of politician, but in particular for councillors, because we don't have social media managers and so on. And what it allows you to do is to share what you're doing or share information with your constituents explicitly. So not broadly, but there's no comment option, because I know one of the things you raised in the training recently, Craig, is that, you know, if someone else comments on one of my posts, I'm responsible for their comment if I don't take it down. And so I think it's really nice. And they actually use the political mapping data, that's why it's called Mappolitic, to so that if a member of the public logs into it and puts the postcode in, they only see the people that represent them at every level. So I think it's quite a nice one that alleviates a lot of the issues around social media from a standards perspective. And they wrote to all councillors recently. We got a nice keyring and stuff, but it's a really nice platform. So I just thought I would mention that, and it lightens the load a little.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. I've seen some of the recent guidance that's come out on that, and the process now it seems to be taken. So absolutely, and I think as we spoke about in the training then previously as well, that there is that obligation that when people are posting on your pages, you have to accept that responsibility for the types of messages that ultimately being posting, and they are the types of matters I'm expecting to perhaps see more ombudsman intervention in as we go forward, because members, for example, are being perhaps a little bit more wary about what they are posting themselves, but not realising the political debate and the various matters that are coming through. They are necessarily facilitating that level of discussion, and in some cases could be seen to be endorsing it in some way. So it is something that I think is still awaiting a little bit more guidance ultimately from the Ombudsman and additional organisations, but it's something that I personally, I think we're going to see more of over the course of the next coming years, certainly.
It's Craig. Karen.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, following on from that, really, I think the worst part of social media is, you know, you're always attacked whatever you say. You're either right with some people or wrong with a lot of people. But what I think is the most difficult to handle is the comments that might be put on social media about you, and you can't really respond unless you were going to get into trouble yourself. So I welcome all of this training. I think it'll be very helpful and useful to us. But I think that is one of the frustrations. Craig, you will know the history with my local area. And, you know, it's not easy to deal with all these nasty comments online when you can't reciprocate, you daren't reciprocate, because, as you say, you're just giving fuel to the flames, aren't you? And it makes the matters worse. So, thank you.
You're absolutely right, Councillor Edwards. Members sometimes can be in a very difficult position where the ability ultimately to comment back is always going to be very much restricted. It's interesting, one of the points I often raise in training that is there as an obligation on members to treat people with respect and consideration, but I often view it as a two-way street ultimately as well, that as members you are not here to be abused by members of the public, and therefore it's appropriate that you have options and you have controls open to you to be able to deal with such matters as well. And again, it's things like that hopefully we can perhaps try and consider as part of the task and finish group and the work ultimately that we look at. One example could be if somebody insults you or makes a derogative comment about you on social media, well, what can you do ultimately as part of that process? So I certainly think those are the types of issues perhaps we can try and look and expand on, and perhaps where we can give some useful guidance then ultimately to our elected members.
Craig, other comments or observations? Tom.
Yeah, we have in South Wales Police, we have a regional cybercrime prevent team, and part of their role is going around to different organisations, giving preventative advice about exactly some of the aspects that have just been raised. So I think when it comes to perhaps the second meeting where you're looking at specifically the work that could be undertaken, perhaps one of those guys could come along and speak and give us some advice.
I would very much like that because I mean, I'm conscious I'm not an expert on social media and the various different options ultimately that I try to avoid to like the plague almost just about in some ways, but I recognise that it is a very important communication tool, and whereas I can talk about some of the code of conduct obligations and all the various aspects there, hearing from people who deal with some of the operational things on the ground could be very give a unique vantage point ultimately to members. So I'm hopeful of trying to get some additional information to you in that regard as well. So that organisation could be very useful. Tom, I agree absolutely.
Thank you, Tom. That would be really helpful. I have a question. Is social media covered by libel laws?
Absolutely, indeed. So the criminal and civil laws are equally applicable with social media. Libel law is always extremely difficult to take any sort of potential action on, particularly in the areas of defamation and slander, with all the various different legal tests ultimately that need to be captured. But absolutely, it is equally applicable in the work program of social media. We also have processes as well where you have the social media platforms you can make various complaints to, where if defamatory information is posted or something that is completely inappropriate, I always encourage members to record it to the complaints process in social media. Nothing really happens about it, unfortunately, in those circumstances. But again, there are numerous different avenues we'll be able to talk about to address various matters, hopefully.
Okay, Craig. Any other questions? The task and finish groups, who will right. I just finish my question. The task and finish groups, who's going to be on those task and finish groups?
I was opening it up to all members of the Standards Committee. So if you are welcome to attend, if you can't attend, then that's absolutely fine as well. But it was going to be open up to all of the Standards Committee. I think everyone will have a very unique point that they would be able to bring and views to this particular work programme. But again, it's not compulsory. It's if you can attend, that would be fantastic. If you can't, for a particular reason, that's absolutely fine.
Presumably you're having officers as part of this task and finish groups as well, are you?
It will be myself leading it. I'll be bringing in somebody from our comms and marketing team, hopefully, once I pass them nicely, if they will also give some guidance ultimately as well to the types of training. I'm also trying to get some details on the types of training, obviously, that external organisations ultimately provide, and so I can give you an overview of those elements if I can't get them in person. So I'm going to try and bring in as many different people as I can at this stage.
And will you be asking for volunteers, or are people going to express an interest to you? How do you want to work this?
What I'll do is I will extend the invite to all members. As I said, if the aim is we're going to do this after a standards committee meeting to try and keep it more manageable, if members can stay for it, that would be great. If you can't, that's absolutely fine as well. If you can come to one, but you can't come to another, it's whatever works. But I'd just be very eager for any viewpoints that people would have. So it will just be open to everyone within the committee.
Excellent. Thank you, Craig. Sarah.
Thank you. So I was just aware that the Welsh Government are currently rolling out some free training to town and community councils called Cyber Ninja. I don't think it's quite been deployed yet, but I mean, that could be in line with this sort of thing as well. So perhaps they'd be willing to share resources on that front.
Absolutely. I know the Cyber Ninja is talking about a lot of other different matters associated with GDPR, data protection, and the various different aspects there. But I'll certainly look to find out if there's any social media aspects associated with that as well, maybe that we can try and utilize at the same time.
So, I mean, there's also an element of security with social media, isn't there? So, I mean, if someone takes your account, hacks your account, or if you don't have a strong password, then, I mean, that could obviously do a lot of damage, and it would be perceived as you doing it. So, but I think it's generally about technology and how we use it as councillors. So it's probably going to kind of include social media, I would have thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Right, the recommendation is that we note the current training that members receive at the moment, and we agree to establish a task and finish group to look at specifically the issues around social media. Do we agree that recommendation? Yes. Thank you very much. Item 8 is around gifts and hospitality. Craig.
Thank you, Chair. Again, another important policy ultimately that we have in place ultimately for our elected members is our gifts and hospitality protocol that's been in place and is enshrined ultimately as part of our constitution. So the principles we have to embed as part of our code of conduct are that members must not put themselves in a position where their integrity is called into question by any financial or other obligation to individuals that might seek to influence them in the performance of their duties. So the way in which we ultimately say that then is that members must avoid accepting from anyone gifts or hospitality which might be seen to be placing them under some sort of improper obligation. Now, we don't say to members that you have to decline every element or gift or hospitality that you received. The onus is on the elected member themselves to make a determination ultimately as to whether something is appropriate or not. But the key element that they need to take into account is that it mustn't be seen as placing an obligation on you or give the perception that obligations are ultimately perceived on you. So the gifts and hospitality protocol that we have in place states that members must make declarations of any gifts or hospitality received, but also gifts and hospitality that is declined, and then that will be logged in a public register which is open to inspection at any particular time by any member of the public. And we don't often have members of the public ultimately come in to view it, but what we do get are freedom of information requests, where we often find journalists may request a copy to ultimately see what is on that particular list, or if there's been anything there which may ultimately cause a story in some format. Fortunately, in Neath, Talbot, we've never had that particular issue, and we may continue. So the manner in which it works is we have a standard form which we ask members to complete, and that notification then is given to myself as monitoring officer, and I upload that register. So I've always got an up-to-date version associated with it. Training is quite key, and development opportunities for members in this sense, where I try and explain obviously the importance of the gift and hospitality protocol. And I think one of the issues which some members ultimately forget is it's not just gifts and hospitality that has been received, it's gifts and hospitality that have been declined. That's a very important aspect, so I can make a log of that at the same way for it. There are various different thresholds ultimately throughout Wales in respect of what requires declaration and what doesn't. Some authorities are having £50, some authorities have £25, and some authorities operate a zero where everything ultimately should be declared. in monitoring officers forums that I've been in at the moment, it's been suggested that perhaps this is causing some confusion because different authorities are adopting various different protocols in this regard. So there has been suggestion of a uniform figure ultimately being applied in the region of £25. That was felt to be an appropriate figure that would enable the standards ultimately to be invoked. So what's before you today ultimately for members is a copy of our current gifts, material, benefits, advantages and hospitality protocol, which sets out the basic elements that members ultimately need to be aware of and what the requirements ultimately will be, and picking up some of the points we were talking about earlier on, what does need to be declared, what doesn't need to be declared. And I take on board the points that we mentioned about maybe a couple of examples being enshrined in that particular protocol could be very useful. And I'll certainly go away then and have a look at that. But also to ask you as a standards committee for your views, whether you feel content to endorse a figure of £25 going forward, and we can use that then as an appropriate threshold for members ultimately to be aware. And the view from pretty much most of the authorities in Wales that they are very supportive of the £25 figure. They think it's quite a realistic amount ultimately for people to go with in that sense. So happy to answer any questions on that, Chair.
Thank you, Craig. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. So first of all, it's just going back to the point from earlier. So page 70 on under 7, again, entry 7 and entry 8, sort of slightly conflict. It's exactly the same thing. But I also, like, as a councillor, sometimes residents do want to give you a very small token, like maybe a handmade thing or something, and you try to say no, but I mean it gets to a point where you don't want to offend by refusing, and I'm just a little concerned. Like these are very small tokens, lovely as they are, but I mean I'm thinking about your workload, Craig. I mean if it gets to the point where we have to declare every little thing, I can give an example here. I'm not sure I want to, but I can. I'm literally in the process of writing you an email to declare it. But one of my residents that I helped out recently, he makes braided bracelets and necklaces, and he gave me like a red one because he saw that I like red, and it's handmade and stuff, and it's lovely. It's really lovely, and I was really touched by it. But I mean, I have no idea what the monetary value of it is, but it certainly wouldn't be anywhere near £25. I'm just conscious, like, if we have to report every little thing like that, you know, one of my colleagues on community council, he gets a lot of promotional stationery from his family who have it for their work, and he tends to give that to, do I need to declare that kind of thing? Because he knows I use quite a lot of stationery in my work and stuff. I'm a little worried about you getting inundated with very, like, I think there's a good reason to have a lower threshold is what I'm trying to get at. And while I'm fine with £25, I will say that, you know, even a bunch of flowers, you know, a lot of the time they're going to hit the £50 threshold these days, you know, if they're from a florist, and if we're lowering it, I think a lot of things are going to be caught in that. And I always think if somebody really wants to annoy their representative, they should send them some flowers, because you have to fill in a book of forms every time you get them. So I'm just a little worried that this might be making a rod for our own backs type thing.
I understand exactly where you're coming from, Councillor Thomas. I think it's something we're going to have to keep a very watchful eye on in that sense to see the threshold, whether it's been extended or not. I think the reason the £25 ultimately has been suggested is because it is that middle of the road figure. It was felt that £50 maybe is perhaps too higher an amount these days, and when you look at the average cost of different events and different sort of gifts ultimately that would come in, the consensus appeared to be that £25 figure was ultimately correct. We are going to try out some ways ultimately to make it a little bit more easier for members ultimately to be able to make those declarations. So whereas at the moment, for example, you have a form which you need to fill in, whether that's electronically or personally, and then return it to myself, we're going to see if we can find some ways to digitize it a little bit more, so that it would just enable you to go onto your members hub section, maybe filling that form. It would just give me a notification then that something has been uploaded onto the system, so I can monitor it, which will help take some of the administrative processes out of that as well. But just picking up some of the points that you mentioned as well, as we've talked about in the actual protocol itself, promotional gifts, pens, calendars out, we're not really talking about those sort of elements here. What we're looking at are the gifts and hospitality benefits ultimately that you are receiving in kind in respect of your role ultimately here as an elected member, and that particular item is associated and being given to you because you are an elected member in some format. That's the requirement ultimately, to look at the declaration of it, to make sure that we have that on file, because not only then obviously is it being recorded, but it is giving you the necessary protection from a transparency perspective, that anything that has been given is on the record and being declared, and nobody then would be able to perhaps declare that you've received something inappropriately or question your integrity in respect of any voting matters, whatever the case may be, because you've always been fully transparent in all of those processes and in total compliance then with the code of conduct at the same time.
So can I come back on this? So perhaps for a little bit of clarity, obviously the promotional gifts were given to someone else. They gave them to me. However, it was a colleague. So I'm going to come back and ask a question. I will say that the conflict between 7 and 8 does seem a bit stronger here, because like, at one point it says there is absolutely no threshold, and then it says literally a £25 threshold. So it seems like there's a bit more of a conflict there. But with the gifts thing as well. So sometimes, for example, I get along very well with my colleague in my ward, and sometimes I'll buy her a gift. Would she need to declare that kind of thing? Because like we're friends, and it would be more of a personal gift rather than in her capacity as a councillor. But obviously, my main interaction is through council work.
No, I don't think you've got to worry about that particular scenario. It's more about the gifts that you've been given and our hospitality you've been offered in respect of your role as a councillor. So the fact that you may have given a present to a colleague councillor in that sense, things like that are not ultimately caught underneath it. It's more what you've received maybe from constituents and ward members in that sense, as opposed to anything else.
Thank you, Sarah. Duncan?
I'm going to put the cat amongst the pigeons. I'm afraid for me, it should be 0. I think you go into so many dark corners when you accept hospitality. And I'll give you an example. So as I was talking earlier, I will be in the Middle East next week, a country which is resplendent with wealth. I chair a review of a university and I'm given a gift at the end. So I open the gift up and it's a Mont Blanc pen. It's a pen. Okay, so if you have the word pen in your acceptable gifts, where do you draw the line of what the pen is? I appreciate the language, the intent behind the statement is promotional gifts. You can interpret that in a number of ways. I appreciate you in this day and age, £25 doesn't go very far, but if you make it 0, then it's pretty clear, carte blanche, nothing is acceptable. At the end of the day, you are working as a public servant, and you get into very difficult situations of making judgment calls as to what should be declared, what its value is, and the administration around the management of that makes it really difficult. I appreciate there might be an outlier here, and other people have different views, but I think I don't know about Tom with the police, but my understanding of police work is it's a 0 tolerance situation, and I think we're on much safer ground if we were to do that. But that's just my view. So,
oh, absolutely valid comment, Duncan. Interesting. Yeah, Tom.
Craig, obviously you get notification on, you put these on the register. Is there some sort of panel that makes an adjudication around what should and shouldn't be accepted?
Not as such, no. Obviously, the onus is on that member to make the determination themselves, and I always encourage them, if they're not sure as to whether they should be accepting it, they need to take the appropriate advice ultimately from myself as to whether there are any issues associated, and it involves us looking at the circumstances ultimately surrounding the gift, the hospitality, whatever the case may be. But the way the code of conduct is ultimately drafted, it's up to that individual member to make a determination as to whether it's appropriate or not. And if, for example, somebody has received something which a general member of the public feels is ultimately inappropriate, then it remains open to that member of the public to make a complaint to the Ombudsman as a potential breach of the code of conduct. If there are issues, and that member then needs to perhaps have to justify why it was appropriate ultimately for them to accept that gift, and it didn't place them under any sort of obligation in any sense of the word.
Okay, thanks. It's just obviously in the police services, slightly different procedure in relation to the receipt of gifts and benefits. Whereas the superintendent in charge of PSD will ultimately sit with a DI or a DCI, and the three of them will then make a decision as to whether that gift should have been received, declined, and take the appropriate action out the back of it. I don't think in our circumstances here with the council members and elected members that would be feasible, to be perfectly honest, because more of the gifts are sort of given impromptu style rather than sort of pre-planned meetings and hospitality, which is probably a little bit easier to manage.
What about, well, can you sort of give a view on Duncan's suggestion that it should be zero tolerance?
It is absolutely fine. It's a determination for each individual authority as to what approach ultimately that they wish to go for. And there are some authorities who do adopt a zero approach. There are some who adopt 50. There are some who adopt 25. There is no hard and fast rule ultimately. And if it's something that as a standards committee we feel quite appropriate about, that it should actually be zero tolerance and everything ultimately should be disclosed, that is an avenue, of course, that can certainly be considered, and that can be the view that's taken forward. There is no hard and fast rule, as I said, and we could easily stick to zero. We could easily go to 25. 25 does give flexibility to elected members. In the sense that obviously if they receive the ad hoc bottle of wine, the ad hoc bunch of flowers, box of chocolates for helping out a constituent, there's no obvious obligation ultimately then to ultimately disclose. But ironically, I always tell elected members, disclose everything in that sense, even though you may not be under a legal obligation ultimately to do so. In the interest of transparency, everything should ultimately be disclosed as part of the process. So because of that, if we felt that a zero figure is appropriate and everything should be disclosed, it's easy for us ultimately to adapt that as part of the process.
Duncan.
Yes, thank you again, Chair. I would agree. I think it's an all or nothing situation. If you decide you can disclose some things but not others, then that's the pathway to disaster. So it's much safer to declare everything. The figure of 25 or 0 or somewhere in between or above is a matter for debate. I appreciate, but I think given the events of number 10 and recently, you give us a prime example. If we accept some hospitality, we open ourselves up to accusations of unfair practice, however unintentional that might be. And yeah, I just think in the days that we find ourselves, it's much easier to have a zero figure on that. And then everyone knows exactly where they stand. But as I say, I appreciate that might be an outlier here. So,
well, we'll take a collective view across the committee, because I sense you are proposing, that we have a zero tolerance. So when the discussions have concluded, we'll go down that route. I've got a question around that, in that members will go to a conference, for example, and on the desk is a promotional pen, and there's a pad of paper, and there might be a mouse mat, or there might be one of these little fluffy figures that you can stick on your computer. Don't know if they still do those, but in my day that was the kind of thing. Are you suggesting that those kind of things should be declared when everybody in the room is having a promotional pen, not just members, but officers and anybody else who is attending? So I think we just have to think about the level of detail that we go down to when we are proposing a zero tolerance.
It's not designed for those types of gifts ultimately, because they are deemed to be gifts which are open to anyone in that sense who is ultimately attending an event. It's not something that is going to place you under a material obligation or give that improper perception, obviously, for it. So I think it's important to make clear that the gifts and hospitality protocol is not designed to cover those particular aspects where those elements are being declared. Similarly with civic receptions, functions maybe which lunch ultimately is being included in, those elements would be excluded. It may be the case if we are going to go down to the zero element, then some updated guidance needs to be incorporated into the gifts and hospitality protocol just to clarify that and hopefully avoid any ambiguity to members then at that point.
Okay, right. Okay.
Just one other observation, if I may. In my past experience working in universities, the threshold was £5. And then anything deemed to be above that. And quite often students, when they graduate, are grateful for their experience and will come with all sorts of things, some of which you don't really want, but still. What the universities used to do is then put them into an auction, which if the staff member who's in receipt of wanted to bid for, they could make a donation and then receive the gift back. Or it could be put into a charitable auction for the benefit of student hardship, for example. So it would be an annual event, and then all money raised would go. And the same thing could happen in the local authority sense, where the mayor's nominated charity for that year. So there are a number of ways you can navigate around it. But just picking up on Craig's response, and your question, I would completely endorse that. Any promotional gift or in a pack for conference attendance is non-disclosable.
I mean, I quite agree. I was really asking it so that we were absolutely clear what we were talking when we were talking about zero tolerance. Before we move to taking this further, I do have a question to ask, which is around the very good point around gifts that are declined, because declining is equally important, or registering that you've declined is equally important because of the message. If you don't record that you've declined it, inference can be drawn, can't it, in various ways. So in paragraph 6, which is matters which is not necessary to disclose, we've only got in 6.2, it is encouraged that a member record with the monitoring officers those gifts that have been declined. So it's only encouraged. I just wonder whether that should be stronger, because this is about protecting the member, and encouragement seems to be a bit of a voluntary thing. So I put that to you, really, to whether that should be stronger.
I agree, Chair. I think in that sense, we should take out the word "it is encouraged" and just say members must record with the monitoring officer, officers of hospitality, on gifts declined. I think that would be a very sensible amendment for us to make.
Okay. Fine. Okay. Oh, Sarah, your hand is up.
It is. Thank you. So I just I'm going to come back to this. So on page 70, number 7, it says members must notify receipt of gifts, material benefits, advantage, and hospitality, irrespective of value. And then in point 8 on the next page, it explicitly says you only have to do it if it's £25 or more. I feel like that is confused. I was confused reading that. I'm still confused after this discussion, and I feel like that needs clarifying. But I'm also curious. So with the is there a way for us to clear this up? So you're talking about all these different authorities. I mean, maybe we could actually have it as suggest to the people that write the code of conduct that they actually put a limit in there, because I was under the impression there was an upper limit of £50. So clearly some people have chosen to go lower, but perhaps if it's generally the feeling that 25 is a good figure, then maybe we could suggest that the limit there'd be a hard limit, not an upper limit, but a hard limit of £25. If people want to declare everything, fine, but if all authorities in Wales could just have the same limit, because it does seem quite confusing to have different settings that for different authorities, and some people might even sit on different authorities at the same time. So
absolutely correct. I think I take your point what you're saying there, Councillor Thomas, and I think that was one of the initial intentions where they were talking about trying to have some sort of consensus figure ultimately through the different authorities ultimately in Wales, but recognising it is a decision ultimately for the Standards Committee to make that determination on. What I would suggest is, if after the meeting today, obviously we've agreed the consensus whether we wish to go with the 25 or go for a full everything being declared aspect, I'd have to go back, obviously, to look at the actual gifts and decorations hospitality protocol to make sure that clarity is obtained throughout, and obviously picking up some of the amendments that we've spoken about today then as well. And that'll give me the basis then of just making sure that we're tidying up of loose ends. So I think the fundamental issue, obviously, before the members today is obviously note the types of matters that we do have within our protocol at this stage and the overarching content. Agree what figure we want to go with. Is it going to be 0 or is it going to be 25? And then I'll work on presenting a updated version of the Gifts and Hospitality Protocol, and I'll bring that back ultimately then to the Standards Committee for you to endorse at one of our next meetings.
seem to recall at a previous meeting, you mentioned that you sit on a sort of national panel to do it. Perhaps that would be a good route to maybe try and get a bit of unity so that everyone is playing on by the same rules then across the board in Wales. Just a thought. So
No,
it shouldn't be this confusing, should it? So
No, that's absolutely fine. As I said, the national panel will be, and our chair is actually going to be sitting on a national panel as well. And I think one of those meetings is taking place at the end of this month. And I think it could actually be one of the items on the agenda. So we may have a little bit of an inroad at that point as well to find out some views of what other authorities are taking as well.
Thanks, Sarah. And yes, absolutely, it can go on the agenda. Coming back to Duncan's suggestion that we have a zero tolerance, that's something we probably need to propose and have a
Yes, please.
So, Duncan, are you proposing that we have a zero tolerance in terms of declaring?
Yes, I am.
Okay. May I have a seconder, please? Alison, second.
Yes, I'll second.
And may we have a vote on that, please? All those in favour? 2, 3.
If members at home could put their electronic hands up, please. If members in the chamber could put and keep their actual hands up, please. Thank you.
2, 3. Okay, 3, 4, and against? Three against. Casting vote. Yes. Oh, dear.
Just to confirm, there was 3 in favour and 3 against to that proposal, so the chair will exercise her casting vote now. Thank you.
Well, I'll go for zero tolerance. So the vote is carried 4 to 3. But I will be attending this meeting of the chairs of the Standards Committee at the end of June. And I do think that would be a really good opportunity to raise that with them to see what the tenor is right across Wales with other councils. And then we can revisit it if necessary. I can bring that back. Wayne.
Thank you, Chair. Just to comment, I personally would have gone along with the £25 limit. We spoke about councillors being abused via social media. And I think we're living in a day and age when the word thank you or appreciation is not heard enough. And although I know we have to be very careful that we're not seen to be taking a bribe for whatever we are doing, it's nice sometimes to be appreciated rather than used. And I think, you know, that we are making a lot of work for ourselves with the zero tolerance sort of suggestion. So that's just my views. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. That's a very valid comment. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. That was a very useful and excellent discussion. So thank you. Item 9 is, grants of dispensation.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a request for a grant of a dispensation, which is within the gift of the Standards Committee, in respect of a member of Gwaenca Gyrwen, Councillor Len Preece. He is a trustee of Canolfan Mardy, which is a registered charity that operates out of that particular electoral ward. Councillor Preece is asking for a dispensation that because of this being a community anchor organisation, there are various different matters ultimately that come before the particular authority, Gwaenca Gyrwen Community Council, in respect of this particular organisation, which would mean usually he would have to step out of decision-making processes when that takes place. So he has asked for dispensation to be able to speak and vote on issues relating to Carnarvon Mardy, Gwauncaigurwen Community Council, provided that they do not directly financially advantage or disadvantage or give a benefit or disbenefit to that particular member or the member's family. It doesn't relate to a grant application or consideration of a contract between Carnarvon Mardy and the Community Council, and the dispensation will not apply in circumstances where a member of the public might reasonably conclude that the role of trustee would alter or affect the council's ability to act. So members of the Standards Committee are entitled to grant a dispensation where they are content that the nature of the member's interest is such that the inability to participate would upset the political balance of the meeting to such an extent that the outcome would likely be affected. The participation would not damage public confidence, and the business relates to finances or property of a voluntary organisation, and the councillor sits on that management committee or board with no other interest. It's important to note that Councillor Priest doesn't receive any remuneration ultimately for this role. We have had similar dispensations from other members of the Gwauncaigurwen Community Council in respect of this matter previously, and therefore I'm happy as monitoring officer that it is within your gift ultimately to grant that dispensation. So it's before you today for approval, Chair.
Thank you very much, Craig. Any comments or observations? Thank you. Do we approve the recommendation that Community Councillor Len Priest is granted dispensation to speak on the aforementioned matters? Thank you very much. We will now move into a private session. May I have a proposer to move the relevant legislation, please? Yep. Carried. Oh, sorry, Sarah, you've got your hand up.
Sorry, I was willing to propose or second that.
Okay, thank you. We are now in private session.